And I'm told that unless I stand next to you, you need this.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, the members of the committee. It's my privilege today to share with you some of the work the Aerospace Corporation has done in support of the committee's work. Today we will talk specifically about two of our studies. We've done several, but we'll talk specifically about our look at alternative launch concepts and our assessment of the Constellation program. Before we begin that, I'd like to put these studies into some context for you. And I've taken them here in reverse order, from which I will present them later. First, let's talk about our assessment of the Constellation program. Here we have an existing government program of record. Detailed data exist in all elements of that program so far, and I would point out that NASA has been entirely cooperative and gracious in supplying us all the data that we could use and digest in the short period of time we had to do this study. We did not and were not able to do detailed cost analyses, independent cost estimates, those kinds of things that would have been useful. Those efforts generally are in the several month category rather than the 2 to 3 week category that we had in support of you. But they did give us data, we did use it, and we did try to assess that data in our findings today. When you have a program that is a government program and is reasonably far along in its development, you understand the risks and the challenges more deeply and more thoroughly than you might for some other systems. And we'll talk more in a few moments about how we looked at those risks, but that's an important factor. And importantly, for a government program of record, it either conforms to or doesn't conform to the existing funding profiles that that agency has. And I'll show you in a moment how important that element is. But all of these kinds of things go into an assessment of a government program of record. So it is as detailed as time allows and as the program has to date with its own progress. Then secondarily, you look at our request to assess alternative launch concepts. And note the differences here. Here we have systems that are at various levels of maturity from, as Bo said, design studies to vehicles and systems that are attempting to get into test flight to systems that have flown in other configurations perhaps than the one that would be required for Constellation. Believe it or not, we find that when you look at purely commercial systems with the limited historical data we have, that getting to a full, mature, reliable initial operational capability might even in fact take longer than a government program. So those things have to be considered in a historical context. We realize that for these systems, limited data exists. More data on some programs than others, but in all cases, more limited for our purposes in our evaluation than that which we got from the Constellation program. We know that challenges exist with these programs, so when a provider suggests that he might be able to accomplish a part of the Constellation mission, many other questions must be asked. Are you going to integrate the Orion? Are you going to integrate the EDS? What are you doing about Altair and other configurations? Have you contemplated in your proposals of when you can get your launch vehicle ready? Have you contemplated these integrations? Do you understand those challenges? And even for some programs who say, I'm not going to use those elements of the existing architecture, I will develop my own, then that brings a whole new set of challenges too. Many of those, at least to us, are reasonably, or at least comparatively, unknown with regard to the kind of things we see in the Constellation program. We recognize the importance of COTS. We recognize that progress is being made there. We congratulate NASA and the providers for that. We wish them success, and it accomplishes an important mission, but it is a complement to exploration. It doesn't accomplish the exploration mission in terms of the medium lift vehicle and the heavy lift vehicle and getting out of low Earth orbit, as both speakers have said before me. And really importantly, we did not have time, and perhaps it's not knowable at this point, what the conformance would be to budget profiles. And that's critically important. Someone might say that they can develop a program in a certain period of time for a certain amount of money, but a lot of detailed work has to be done before you would see how that fits into the funds that are available to that program. So I'd just like us to keep those comparisons in mind as we go, because there is this tendency on all our parts to take the results of one study and apply them and compare them to the results of the other study. And it is my personal view that that would be a disservice to both studies if we did that. They are different, they approached it differently, and they were for different opinions. In fact, my view of our assessment of alternative launch concepts was, as Bo said, to provide a level playing field for comparison among those systems in that class of vehicles. Which ones of these guys look better or worse, and who's trying to do what mission? To take the results of those and apply them directly to our detailed analysis of Constellation, I think, can create some problems. So what did we do? We were asked to do a comparative assessment now in the alternative launch vehicle assessment for these systems. We spent some time figuring out how to do this because we recognize, as I've said before, some systems are flying, some systems are in design, systems have various claims, they're attempting to do various missions. So we developed an assessment methodology by using metrics to assess these alternative launch concepts. We shared those metrics with all the providers of the various systems. We told them what our task was and how we were going about it and how we were going to assess or grade their systems. We offered them the opportunity to share with us anything they chose, either in person or by delivery. And all of the systems either did come in and brief aerospace for a half day at a time or provide data to us as they saw fit. So we took that data that they provided to us and tried to come up with an assessment. Everybody knows, and you saw the chart that Bo showed a moment ago, and I'll show it again in a moment, that these systems are of various capabilities, at least when looking at mass to orbit. They are attempting to do different parts of the mission. They have varying levels of claims of what they are trying to do. We tried to look at these systems with regard to cost and schedule and performance, and clearly safety and human rating. Are these systems human ratable? What do we see about maturity? What do we see about design factors that we understand NASA is applying to the Ares 1 program? How would we see those flowing down? Do we believe the offerers have assessed those as they would need to incorporate human reliability? What about ascent trajectories? What about G-loading? So we tried to interpret those kind of things as much as we could because we realized that safety and human rating is pervasive and most important as you look at alternative options for doing a part of this mission. In looking at the Constellation mission, we categorized these offerers into these four classes, as you can see here: crew to ISS and cargo to ISS, and then crew and cargo to the Earth orbit lunar rendezvous point, by attempting to show who is attempting to do what. It was important for us to set up a metric process where a person who is claiming and offering to take humans to ISS and lunar rendezvous orbit is not penalized because he can't do the heavy cargo mission. So we had to find a way to give, as Bo requested of us, a level playing field against what these systems are proposing to do and claiming to do and how that fits into the system. You saw this chart earlier, just a reminder to us as we go through that systems are of various capabilities and various sizes, and that's important to the committee. The kinds of systems that you would anticipate or contemplate putting into an architecture in your recommendation. So we recognize we have folks from Taurus on one end to the big guy Ares 5 on the other end, and how does that fit into the mission that you're trying to accomplish? We also have charted these offerers as they claimed to us against the parts of this mission that they were trying to accomplish, and you can see that here. No surprises here, but it's a reminder to us to keep in mind as we evaluate various systems, what is it that they are offering to do and what is it that they're claiming to do. The way Aerospace approached this problem, as I said, was to receive data from these companies. Now, Mr. Chairman and the committee, as you well know, every page of every piece of that data came to Aerospace stamped company proprietary. And we took that data and assessed it and rolled it into a massive presentation that many of you have already received, some of you more than once. It's about a 3-hour presentation when we're hurrying. But that data, even as we've assessed it, we hold to still be proprietary. There's not time today in this public session to give you individual assessments of these alternate launch vehicle systems, nor did we have the time, honestly, to go back to each of those companies and have them go through a detailed analysis of whether or not they would consider what we said about their information to be proprietary or not. So with your permission today in this study, I'm going to show you how we went about it, recognizing that the committee has the data that we've given you in your fact-finding sessions in great detail in each of the areas, but I think it's important for the committee and the public to understand how we approached this problem. We did look at system claims from the offerers, and everybody has claims about cost, performance, schedule, and how human rateable they are if they're offering to do that mission. So everybody was consistent in making claims around those metrics. But there were also other metrics that we felt were important that weren't necessarily claimed by the offerers. Some of them were, some of them weren't. Some offerers didn't have much to say about infrastructure. Many didn't have much to say about the NASA workforce. Clearly it is important, as you've heard already from Marshall. It's important to consider the workforce. So we tried to assess the effects with these metrics that I categorize as not necessarily claimed by the system, yet we wanted to see what we thought about their claims in these areas. And then finally, we had over 70 secondary metrics that we used to inform these primary metrics. So beyond each of these is more and more and more detail of how we came to our view on performance or operability or any of those factors. We began by creating a quad chart for each of the systems we looked at, and this is just a sample and example, the only one I will show. But we tried to list what the offerers were claiming for their performance capabilities in your upper left. And the lower left, we tried to write down what we felt the strengths and weaknesses were of that system as offered and proposed to us. In the upper right, you can see that we assessed those systems against those primary metrics that I displayed on the previous slide and gave them a grade and a color coding, with green being better and yellow and red being worse. And you can see in this particular case blank spots because this particular system isn't offering to do crewed ISS. It's the cargo carrier. So we did this kind of individual system assessment against the 4 missions for each of the systems. And in the lower right section, we attempted to list critical assumptions. Those in the top dark blue box, those are the critical assumptions as given to us by the offerers. Things that they understand are important to the success of their program. And then the light bluer section is aerospace's independent thoughts about this system and those critical assessments. So the committee has that detail at the proprietary level for each one of these systems. Next chart, please. Then we rolled all these data up by these 4 mission classes as I've described to you and gave a ranking against each metric for each class of system for each one of the systems. And here I've been required to make more generic the top labels I've called them System 1 through System N. These would be the individual offerers across the top of that, so you can get a snapshot. If you're concentrating on crewed ISS, you can get in this snapshot how we looked at each of those systems. We did 2 ratings here because it was important for us to do that. We gave a rating of how we felt and our assessment was of the offer made by this particular system against this particular mission, and then we felt obliged to give it an uncertainty rating. And what that means to us is System A could say, I can take humans to low Earth orbit during this time for this money and on this schedule and with this master orbit, and we make an assessment about that, and we might be very sure about our assessment, which would be a high confidence factor. Or we might not be very sure about our assessment. There's just not enough data for us to know. So the committee, as many of you already know, have to look at what aerospace said about it and how certain we were about what we said about it. And we apologize for that fuzziness, but in the time we had, we felt it was only honorable for us to make that statement to you that in some cases we are surer of our statements than in other cases. The next thing we did, which we thought would be important to Bo's work and the committee's work, was to make a comparative assessment, again, against these mission classes. Given a mission class and all of the offerers, who appears to be the best of class, who appears to be the worst of class, and who's in the middle? So you get the assessment of each individual system, you get the assessment of all systems against the mission, and then you get an assessment that shows how do we see them ranking among each other as we go through the various assessments by mission. Now we turn to what do we say, how do we approach for the committee our view of claims of cost and schedule, which are so dramatically important. Well, every offerer made some claim about cost and schedule. And we represent those in this generic chart as a green ball. This is what they are claiming to us they can do. In this period of time, the best product aerospace could produce in this regard was to bound those claims in our best knowledge of historical evidence. And that you see by the blue bars and the red bars. So depending on what the system is offering, we could apply a historical factor that says, we understand how this is done, and it's normally been done pretty quickly. Maybe it's a modified vehicle, or in some of the other bars, perhaps it's a brand new vehicle, and that applies a different set of historical data. So aerospace pulled together for these bars every piece of historical information we have in the history of the company, and every piece of historical information we could get our hands on in order to give you some sense of, simply with regard to history, what does the claim the offerer is making look like with regard to history? Again, I would point out that while informative to the committee, I trust, this is still a very different assessment than looking at a program of record and going specifically to the thousands of program elements and making assessments about those. So it is what we did for cost, and the committee has that data, again, for each system at the proprietary level. Please. Same thing with schedule. We did the same technique. We took their schedule claims. We bounded them by history. You'll notice just by example in the first one, if you're talking about a medium launch vehicle capability system, you might have an existing system, a new system, or a modified system, and those all bring with them various historical perspective as well. So we did that in the schedule part for each system. We tried to show you whether we felt it was a new development or a modification, or in fact an existing system that was already being built to those kind of performance parameters, what that historical bound looks like, what the offerer is claiming for cost, and what our view is of an initial launch capability and an initial operating capability, and the committee gets some perspective simply with regard to history, what these claims, how these claims are falling into that spectrum. So to complete the view of our look at the alternative launch vehicle assessment summary, again, I'll reiterate that the COTS providers are moving along, they're progressing. This is an important element of Constellation and the overall mission it's doing. But when one looks at the COTS, and we have done other studies for the committee about the importance of COTS to station resupply and how that fits with ATV and HTV, and we all recognize the importance of that program. But it still isn't a plug-and-play change for the kinds of missions that NASA has as its direction right now. We recognize in that chart that showed you the various capabilities of mission offerings with regard to capability to orbit, that if as was said previously, you need to get out of low Earth orbit and you need a big rocket to do that, that you've got to get up into that heavy, super heavy lift capability among these offerers to be able to accomplish what NASA maintains is this two launch solution to get that kind of capability out of low Earth orbit. Obviously, not all systems satisfy all system requirements. That was not a problem, and we hope that our methodology gave you a way of looking at that so that no one is penalized at all if they can do one mission but cannot do another or not offering to do another. So we recognize that right up front. We will point out that there are options for each of these classes of missions among these offerers. The determination now becomes what do we know about those systems? How much more detail would we need to know before we would begin to hold that as a true alternative to the program of record? I'll point out once again that certainty gets greater the farther along a program is. And certainty is certainly greater for programs of record than it is for programs where the offerer says, I can do this in these months for this amount of dollars, and we're trying to put some historical assessment around that. We recognize that some systems omitted things from their offering to us that we felt were critical. Some folks didn't think enough about the infrastructure in our view. Some folks didn't think enough about what it really takes to get a reliable, mature, human-rated system in our view. So we recognize that folks are making offerings, but they might not have considered in their offer what the government and what NASA would consider to be important in terms of an overall architecture. Aerospace did not make architecture assessments in this study but we hope that our work will inform the architecture work that does need to go forward. We intended our work with Bo's direction as we started to be a guide to the committee. We intended this work to give you some view of how these systems are progressing, where they are in their development, how one might look at them with regard to performance or schedule or cost on a level comparative basis, and we hope and believe we've done that. It is our view, and I don't know how this plays in the reality of time, but it would be our view that as the committee deliberates these alternative options and determines that some of them are more desirable or interesting than others, that more detailed work needs to be done to find out what's really in those programs and where they are and what their budget profiles would look like and what their real detailed design scheme is for human rating or to accomplish these missions. So we're proud to have done this work. It was fast, in about 3 weeks. We hope that it's useful to the committee as we've delivered it to you so far. And that summarizes that part of it. Now we'll move into the second part of my presentation, which came in a different way. In fact, came from the chair for us to provide an independent assessment of the Constellation program of record. Not to whine, but to inform, this too was a very compressed time schedule. We did this work in about 3 weeks. You would expect that a detailed independent assessment of a program of this magnitude would be perhaps a several-month effort, but that was not the case. So we were not able to do detailed design reviews. We were not able to do independent cost estimates in the traditional way that aerospace is accustomed to doing that. We had to make assessments about the data provided to us. We did use the data NASA gave us, as I've mentioned, PMR 09 data to IOC, and NASA was gracious in providing us insight into their integrated risk management analysis database, which was very informative into the program as we tried to assess it. As we looked at the Constellation program of record, we tried to look at the effects of the budget, what we thought and felt and believed about the technical risks as we saw them, what it would look like if the ISS were extended from 2016 to 2020, and then within that study, look at the Orion not only as a part of the overall Constellation IOC, but as a standalone piece because the committee needed that if they wanted to see how the Orion might fit on some other alternative capability. What does the IOC look on a critical path perspective for the Orion as well? So we did all that work in this study. You've seen this chart before, I believe. In my view, this, no pun intended, this is the money chart. When you look at what has happened to NASA, regardless of your perspective of any of those lines, when you look at what NASA believed it had and said it desired and what has happened to NASA in the 9 budget and the 10 budget, it should not surprise anyone that problems exist. I will say it again in my conclusion. Aerospace believes that NASA is not properly funded to accomplish its current program of record. So we should not be surprised that aerospace is going to say we think it'll take more money. We should not be surprised that aerospace says we think the schedule is going to slip. These things happen when programs don't have enough funding and have to compress, push things out, and move them along. We understand that everybody knows that, and we've heard before, nobody ever has enough money, but it is really critical in our view to recognize that as we look at a program, which we will tell you in a moment, we believe is slipping to the right, that they didn't have the money they requested to execute their program as they went along, so things began to happen. We believe that the effect of budget reductions alone, as we see them in the FY10 budget, could result in up to a 1.5 years delay in the Constellation Ares 1 Orion IOC. Others can have different views of that, but as we look at the effects of things that are being moved and shifted around, that is aerospace's opinion, that those budget reductions will cost a 1.5 years from the program of record IOC of early 2015. Next chart. Then we moved into the technical risk assessment, and here's where it gets interesting, and one needs to be very careful about comparisons to the previous study. We looked at thousands of elements in the integrated risk management assessment. We looked at them with regard to what is the risk, how is it categorized, how is it resourced, how is it scheduled, and not surprisingly, in many cases, some cases at least, Aerospace believed that some risks were underrepresented. We believed it was going to take longer than that, or we believed it was going to cost more than that. So when you began to look at thousands of these risks and you winnow them down to the few hundred that you think are really important, and you have assessments about many of these, and they begin to aggregate up in a collective way to an increased schedule. So that shouldn't surprise anyone. We looked at mitigation plans. We made assessments, as the committee asked us to do, about whether those mitigation plans were reasonable and thorough and complex enough, and whether, again, there was enough schedule against them and cost against them as we saw them. We noticed that the risks were more detailed when you looked at the phase of system you're in now. And the risks were a bit less detailed as you looked farther out. Not surprising. That shouldn't really alarm anyone, only to say that those risks that are in the database for future years are going to come to pass too. And one has to understand whether or not they will certainly result in challenges, whether or not they will result in more cost and schedule strains remains to be seen. But one has to understand that there are challenges, as was said previously, all throughout a program. We looked at our final risk element ratings, and we tried to use those to modify S-curves, and I certainly won't get into the necessarily long discussion about S-curves, but we all understand them. What is the confidence level? Is the curve too steep in our opinion? Should it tilt more to the right? And in many cases, we felt that the confidence curves were a bit more tilted than in the program basis of record, and we felt that when you move the confidence factor up, as I know NASA is attempting to do, of course that impacts cost and schedule as well. And then finally, we tried to do an affordability analysis. Again, this is such an important part of the overall assessment of the current program and alternative programs. What is the confidence factor you're seeking to achieve? What mission are you seeking to achieve? And how does that fit into the funding that's available for these programs? Or on the converse, what funding is necessary if you're going to execute this program? When we looked at the cost, schedule, technical, risk, interaction assessment, we believe that that could result in up to a 2-year delay in the Constellation IOC. We recognize and fully accept that there are other opinions about that. We recognize that this was a fast look at aerospace. We stand behind the rationale that brought us to this conclusion. We recognize that the risk can be mitigated and worked through without schedule delay. We realize that the interaction of schedule and cost can be mitigated by funding returns or more robustness in the funding. But we didn't caveat all those things. We simply said, as we see the risk and as we roll up these hundreds, maybe thousands of risk elements, we see those collecting up to as much as a 2-year delay in the program. Inside this assessment, in fact, it began after we had started the Constellation program assessment. We were asked about a weekend to do this individual Orion assessment, primarily with regard to critical path elements, meaning if we need to look at this, we presume that the Orion IOC assessment is umbrellaed in the Constellation assessment, and that is the case. But if we needed to look at Orion as a standalone thing in an architecture with another system, what would that look like? So we did a quick assessment of Orion looking at critical path schedule, and we did notice that the schedule appears to be a bit back-end loaded. That should not be a surprise, and again, the program manager can tell us his opinion about that as well. But as funding is not as robust as one might think, sometimes things slide a bit to the right. Sometimes they get a bit more compressed. And we noticed that there was some compression going on. The critical path still works, but in our opinion, there was not a lot of slack in it. And as things happen, then that often results in schedule change as well. We tried to look at the technical risk around these uncertainties, again, in this particular assessment with regard to how they might affect things on the critical path, thereby affecting the end of the program. And again, we tried to envelop this in an historical perspective, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that here, some of which are more informative than others, honestly, but these are the data we had. So you can see two bar charts here as we tried to compare Orion development to other human spaceflight mission development programs. The top one, PDR through system start, and then the bottom one, system start through launch. Well, you get varying levels of information out of this. You can see in the bottom one that Orion is decently on par with Apollo, but half the time of shuttle, and everybody would have an opinion about why that is the case. The national will behind one program, the inherent difficulties and starts perhaps in the other. So there's not a lot of data to inform this, but nevertheless, that's how the Orion schedule fits into that historical perspective. We said, well, let's then look at something more recent. So we looked at, in comparison to a recent study Aerospace had done of 77 non-human spaceflight missions, and we noticed that the Orion development was a bit shy of those developments, even for non-human spaceflight programs. So when you take the two of those together, you can make some assessment on the committee's behalf of whether or not the historical evidence of the development of a vehicle such as this fits within historical perspectives or perhaps is a little aggressive given the Program of Record IOC of 2015 and whether what our view is of the confidence of that. We also took a look at the extension of the ISS and the effects on human lunar return, ISS extension from 2016 to 2020. We believe just from a perspective of needing to keep the station flying and in the presence of the budget profiles that was our baseline, and that is the FY10 budget, we believe the extension of ISS to 2010 would result in another 6 months delay. Now, one could say we're not going to do it that way. We're going to make sure that Ares 1 and Orion don't suffer that. Well, then something else has got to give, and that was outside our purview, but within the exploration budget, if you keep the station running and it consumes more budget during those years, then that has a negative effect on the funding capability for Orion and Ares 1. There's been a lot of debate about that second bullet, but given our assessment in the 2010 budget and what we believe about cost and schedule, we just simply said there's not enough money in this budget in the near term to do the human lunar return. There are those who disagree with that. There are mitigation plans, but our view is if you can get it started, and Aerospace is now doing that study, I think tasked just late last week, what does a robust human lunar return program look like with regard to time and schedule? But this assessment was, given all these constraints on this budget, what do you see for human lunar return? And we essentially said, we can't see it closing at this point. So that there has to be some work done there. And again, this was the flatline budget, O&B numbers out to about 2015 and a flatline budget after that, which may or may not be the case, but those were the best assumptions we could get. And we did not attempt to do content reduction. We recognize that there are things the agency can do to conform better to the budget it has and the mission given it. We were not asked to do those trades of can you do something different with the Ares 1? Can you do an incremental bill with the Ares 5? Can you get humans to ISS sooner with a capability that will be improved along the way? We did not do those studies. We recognize that they're there. We simply were assessing the program of record. And again, we believe that the FY10 budget, just as a standalone document, requires a real relook at the human lunar program to see where that money is and when it gets started, and then you have a better idea of when you might be able to get that program. So this rolls all that up for you. The top bar simply says that Aerospace's view of just the budget effects without having gone into our technical risk analysis indicates almost a 1.5 year slip, just solely due to budget reductions. But the more important bar is the bottom one, and this is the depiction of what I've said before. We see the budget as costing about 1.5 years. We see technical risk as up to 2 more years. And then if you extended ISS, we see that as another 6 months. So there's where that Aerospace statement of 3.5 to 4 years comes from. I will point out, however, that not all of these things have to happen. The committee could be influential in helping NASA restore some of that budget. That red bar would diminish dramatically in our view. NASA can be successful more so than our assessment predicted on the management mitigation buy down of those technical risks. We hope they are, but our assessment was as you see here. So it's important to note that when Aerospace gives this overall number, which the committee asked us to do, that it does comprise these 3 elements, each of which can be managed and mitigated separately to help this program come in more closely to its program IOC as it stands now. So the assessment of this that aerospace sees the collective cumulative effect of these factors on the Constellation program as reducing or increasing the IOC time as I've displayed there. It is a combined effect, and it is a function of the FY10 budget. I just can't stress that enough, that things begin to happen when budgets get reduced. Our Orion quick look says that on a critical path, we believe that Orion could slip up to 18 months based again on schedule and critical path and things that we believe are probable, have a probability of occurring in the later, more compressed part of the program schedule. Again, we hope and believe that NASA will have mitigation plans against those that are successful in the future. And then finally, as I tried to make sense of both our studies for the committee and attempted to take this podium to tell you what I think they mean, when we look back at history and you look at the inception of the Constellation program, it was doable. It was within what we see as historical bounds, and it was off and running. As I said in my public session to the committee last time, it is an architecture. It behaves like an architecture. Certain elements feed other elements, and that was all designed on purpose, and it was doable. But things happened. Budgets began to get reduced, and that has a dramatic effect. Technical challenges occur, but they always do. So we're certainly not naive enough to believe that in order to be successful, you don't have technical challenges which may stretch your budget. We understand those, and we understand they happen in every program. But when you start reducing budgets and start creating cascading effects, things get moved. Risk perhaps are not managed as thoroughly as you would have liked had you more money, and things begin to ripple, and you get into our assessment of a program that looks like it's stretching as a result of these things. As I've said before, and I'll say finally here, we don't think there's enough money in this program to execute, in the budget to execute this program as it is currently formulated with these capabilities and these IOCs. We don't think that can happen. I will then go on to say that there might not be enough money in this NASA budget to execute any of these programs. We don't know that because we haven't done the kind of detailed analysis of all these alternative offerers to find out what's really in there. So before we take anybody's suggestion that I can do this within the budget, again, we think analysis and details are required there to make sure we don't trade one insufficiently funded program for another insufficiently funded program. And then finally, realizing it's provocative, but there may not be a commercial solution to this whole thing. One may decide that a government program designed the way it is, that is on its way and is experiencing the kind of challenges that programs experience, is the right way to go. COTS is important and should be continued, and I agree with Bo. We need to stimulate commercial and international corporations. But as I talk to colleagues at NASA and as I talk to my own colleagues at Aerospace, when you contemplate putting humans on a completely commercially developed launch vehicle and capsule, that's a big change. And we need to really, really understand that. It is dramatic. All the way to, do we understand maturity and reliability and operability, to what do we know about these systems when something goes wrong and we get into the necessary position of needing to repair and redesign and fix, and then you find yourself beginning to think about government program oversight again. So I would just suggest to all of us as we hear folks who say, I can take humans earlier, just requires our very careful look about what it means to move in that direction. Mr. Chairman, that completes my quick overview of these two studies that Aerospace has done for the committee. As I said, many, many hours of detail exist, much of which has been briefed to Bo and Dr. Wright's committee, and we stand ready to continue to provide that detailed information as the committee desires.
Bo, before we take questions.
Yeah, let me just wrap it up. I've got only like